Hey everyone, my name is Wedge and welcome to the Mana Source Tournament Report. We have some big events to cover from this weekend. We had a Star City Games Open in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of course, but the big thing on everyone's mind right now is Pro Tour Theros in Dublin, Ireland. Let's get started with a quick recap of the SCG Open. This is going to be a little shorter than usual because we feel that the Pro Tour requires a bigger time devotion. In first place, we had a green-red Monsters deck piloted by Zach Stern. What makes this different from Monsters decks we've seen before is that he managed to fit 3 Xenaghost the Reveler into the main deck. Second went to a mono-red aggro deck of a slightly slower variety. Notably, Jeremy Stowe, who took the deck to its second place finish, had a Hammer of Perforos main deck to handle excess lands. In third, we saw an Esper Control deck much like what we've seen before, except with no creatures. It wins exclusively with Elspeth or Ashiok. Fourth and eighth went to red-white aggro decks. The fourth place deck focused more on creatures, with a curve starting from Firedrinker Satyr and Ash Zealot. The eighth place deck was slightly more mid-range, with spells like Chain to the Rocks and Anger of the Gods. Neither deck ran a particularly large amount of white. The decks used white exclusively for Boros Charm or Chain to the Rocks respectively. Fifth and seventh were pretty familiar green-white aggro decks. Valuable 2-drops like Hall of the Conclave, Fleecemane Lion, and Voice of Resurgence were the order of the day, and both decks' curves topped out at Advent of the Worm. Sixth went to a black-red-white mid-range deck. In an interesting twist, one of the deck's big beaters is a Stormbreath Dragon. The deck also only ran 1 Whip of Erebos. Last week, we saw some fluctuation between 1 and 2 of the Whip in mid-range decks. That covers the SCG Open. All those decks are fairly familiar. By stark contrast, the Pro Tour showed us decks we've never even heard of before. Making the biggest splash was Mono Blue Devotion, which took all of the top 3 places in the Pro Tour. We also saw other devotion-heavy builds in black and red in the top 8, along with a few multicolor strategies. Devotion was the word of the day in Dublin. The mechanic was the centerpiece of 5 of the top 8 decks at the Pro Tour. The top 3 of those were all blue. That includes a finals mirror match between winner Jeremy Dezani and second place finisher Pierre Dagan. The blue devotion decks were all nearly identical, and they all focused on one thing. Their mana curves were designed to put as many blue mana symbols on the board as possible each turn. This brought cards to the fore that we never would have expected to see in a major tournament setting. Frostburn Weird and Nightveil Spectre were each 4-ofs in all 3 decks. The deck used that devotion to enable its 2 big devotion-based playsets, Thassa God of the Sea and Master of Waves. An indestructible scry per turn that can make your creatures unblockable is good. Making it into a 5/5 beat stick on top of that, huge! Master of Waves is pretty self-explanatory in this deck. A literal wave of 2/1 elementals can turn the tide of any game in a heartbeat. Cyclonic Rift found its place as removal in all 3 decks, and each ran at least 1 Bident of Thassa. Surprisingly, only 1 of the blue decks took advantage of Nykthos. The others stuck to islands and Mutavaults. The Black Devotion deck in 7th place played a mid-range game. It built up Black Devotion with, outside of creatures, Underworld connections and Whip of Erebos. Erebos himself featured only as a 1-of in the deck. Other than that, the deck went all in on removal. Desecration Demon and Lifebane Zombie were the beaters. Grey Merchant of Asphodel provides a nice win condition if the deck gets its devotion high enough. And even 2 Pack Rat in the deck allow it to build up devotion by making Pack Rat copies with the extra cards off of Underworld connections. A single Nykthos helped provide the mana for that. The red devotion deck in 8th looks almost like the red half of a green-red Monsters deck. Burning Tree Emissary, Ember Swallower, and Stormbreath Dragon throw in 2 red mana symbols apiece. Ash Zealot and Frostburn Weird show up lower on the curve, and Boros Reckoner is a natural fit. Perforos God of the Forge is in fact the only permanent in the deck with fewer than 2 red mana symbols in his cost. A playset of Nykthos allows his mass fire-breathing ability to fire consistently. There are 2 hammers to toss out extra land since the deck runs 26 of them, and a single Chandra Pyromaster helps on the card advantage front. The deck's main source of removal is Magma Jet. Avoiding dead draws is crucial. along with a single Mizzium Mortars. Fourth place went to a deck called Colossal Gruul. In spite of its name, it's mainly a green deck. In fact, it's rather like the other half of the green-red Monsters deck. The deck's red sources are there for Domri Raid and Xenagos the Reveler, though the only 4-of Walker is Garrett Caller of Beasts. Pelucranos World Eater featured heavily in the deck. The other big creature was Arbor Colossus as a 3-of. The deck runs 12 mana dorks, with Elvish Mystic, Sylvan Caryatid, and Voyaging Satyr all present and accounted for. Scavenging Ooze is, as always, a strong inclusion. And Nylea, God of the Hunt, even puts in an appearance, making 4 out of 5 of the Theros gods represented in this top 8. An Esper Control deck took 5th place. This deck still did run a single Aetherling along with 2 Elspeth Sun's Champion. Ashiok, however, did not appear as an additional win con. Beyond that, the deck ran nothing out of the ordinary for a control deck in Esper colors. And in 6th, we had Orzhov Midrange. This looks much like white-black midrange decks we've seen before, with lots of spot removal and a creature base based around Desecration Demon, Blood Baron of Vizkopa, and Obsidian Ghost Council as its win conditions. Interestingly, there were also 4 Soldier of the Pantheon and 4 Precinct Captain in the main deck. Much like the black-red-white midrange deck from the SCG Open, this deck only had 1 Whip of Erebos to its name. The spot removal, interestingly, was entirely in the form of Doomblade and Hero's Downfall. And there you have it. While the SCG Open results painted a familiar picture, most of the Pro Tour decks were something completely different. Aggro has made a comeback and new and unfamiliar forms. Who could have guessed that the top 3 of the Pro Tour would be all aggro in mono blue? Now the fun begins. We get to see these decks trickle down into Star City Games play and maybe even some smaller, more local events. Next weekend, we have a standard Grand Prix in Louisville, Kentucky. There's also a Star City Open in Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll be back again next week with coverage of those events. As always, subscribe below for the latest and most reliable Magic the Gathering information you could ever need. This is the Mana Source. I'm Wedge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.